My name is Professor Elaine Leeder. Um, my age is almost 81. I was born in Lynn, Massachusetts, and I now live in Cotati, California. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home where gender politics were very traditional, with a brother who was favored because he was the male in the family. And my mother was a traditional housewife. I was expected to get married, have babies, not to have a career, not to be political. I was raised in the 50s. So it was a very conventional upbringing with a lot of mental illness. I had a psychotic uncle. My father was a Holocaust refugee. We were immigrant family, I'm first generation. And so with a lot of the troubles that accompany poverty, mental illness, immigration, and Holocaust trauma. That's it in a nutshell, but it's a hell of a lot deeper than all of that if you choose to ask. I grew up outside of Boston. And so, because I was working class, I went to Northeastern University, which is a co op college, school and work and school and work and school and work. For 5 years, I was a sociology major and a psychology minor. Before that, I attended public school in Lynn, Massachusetts, and I grew up in a multi-ethnic, multiracial, what we would now call a multicultural neighborhood. At the time, we just all lived together and really had a good time going to each other's homes for holidays. I had friends of different ethnicities. So my education in public school was a good one. I learned cursive, I learned art, I learned how to write a good paper. And then college, at Northeastern, it's a co-op school, and so you had to school and work. And most of my jobs were fascinating. I did research. I was a sociology major, as I said, and I did research with deaf people. And then I got a job at Mass General Hospital, a large Harvard teaching hospital, in the emergency room. And that was very exciting. I was there during the great blackout of the East Coast, and I met a leper, and I was in the hotbed of trauma in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1960s. And I went to college from 62 to 67, lived during the Boston Strangler era, and lived around the corner from where he committed some of his murders. And then I wanted to get a master's in social work because while I was at Mass General, I met a woman who was a social worker and her career looked interesting to me. She walked around with a white coat, and I thought, oh, that looked good with a little, brochures about people, and she helped them make plans after they were discharged. So I went to get my MSW, my master's in social work, at Yeshiva University in New York City. Because I was looking for a Jewish husband, I wanted to do what my parents wanted me to do. So I did. And while I was getting my MSW, I worked my first year in foster care. And that was amazing. I worked in Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, the hotbeds of inner city, New York City, being a foster care worker. And then I did gerontology, working with aged Holocaust survivors, actually, because I spoke Yiddish. By the way, when I was growing up, I also went to a Yiddish school, which figures later in my career. So I learned, because I was an immigrant's child, to speak that language fairly fluently as a child. Anyway, so I graduated with my MSW, but that was during the 60s, 67 to 70 was when I was in New York. Yeah. And it was the start of the women's movement. And so I'll get into that when I talk about my politics. But in terms of my career, after I got my MSW, I worked in mental health. We were hippies. I married a guy, and we were hippies living in upstate New York, homesteading, and I got a job in a mental health clinic. I got a job working in a psychiatric hospital. I had a private practice. And my career was pretty much direct service, client centered psychotherapy. But then we came out to California to visit my husband's brother, and I was introduced to radical psychiatry, which was a movement against mainstream mental health. And I was invited to come to University of California at Berkeley, to get my master's in public health in community mental health, where I studied radical psychiatry. All along, by the way, I'm evolving politically, but I'm sure you'll ask me about that. And I'm 81, so I have a long career. As a result of having an MSW and a master's in public health, we went back to upstate New York, and we were, as I said, hippie homesteaders. I had a daughter at that time, and I got a job at Ithaca College teaching sociology and social work. And that evolved from a part-time gig into a full-time job. And they told me if I wanted to get a tenure track job, I had to get a PhD. Well, I was living in Ithaca, New York, and Cornell University was on the other hill. So while I was teaching at Ithaca College, I went to the other hill for 5 years and got my PhD in sociology. Actually, it was history and public policy. But I really did, I'll talk about this later too, I did my biography on anarchist history. That was my dissertation. As a result of getting the PhD, I got a tenure track job. I became a faculty trustee on the board of trustees at Ithaca College. And when I was finishing the board of trustees at Ithaca College, I realized I really liked administration. Even though I was a guerrilla in the bureaucracy, I was an anarchist by then. But I really liked going into institutions and really shaking them up and changing them. So I applied to be a dean at Sonoma State University because I wanted to come back to California because the weather is a hell of a lot better than Ithaca, New York. And I got a job as a dean at Sonoma State University. So I moved to California in 2001, worked as a dean for 13 years, continued being a professor during all of that time, wrote 7 books, published countless articles, teach all around the Bay Area. I teach sociology, radical history, radical Jewish history, American radicals, and I continue to write and to publish and to do my political work, which I'm sure you're going to want to hear about. So I would say I've had a wonderful, very delightful career that never stops. I just finished teaching on a cruise ship, and will do so again going to Southeast Asia. I'm also going to be teaching. I forgot to say, after I retired as dean, I was invited to become an interim director of a school of psychology. So I did that for almost a year. As a result of that, I'm going to be teaching for them. My field was family violence as well as radical history. So I'll be teaching for them next fall. So I continue to evolve professionally and to write and to teach and to travel a great deal. I've been to 70 countries in the world. As a sociologist, one of my books is about the family in global perspective. I've also written books about prison work, which is part of my political work. So that's my career and educational history. Growing up in a sexist, homophobic, conservative household, although my family might have been Democrats, I was already primed for agitation. I was angry. My name in the 60s was Fury. I was pissed off at the way I was brought up and the discrimination in my childhood. So when I got to New York, no, actually, it was it was in Boston in the 1960s. Martin Luther King came to Boston. I think it was just after the march in 63. This might have been 65. And I knew about racism. I'd seen it at school. I had friends who were Black who were discriminated against. So I joined a civil rights march in 1965, which would have made me 21. I also started smoking dope, and it was the 60s. It was imbued. The times were transformative. So when I was asked to join a consciousness raising group when I got to New York for my MSW, I went immediately. I marched down Fifth Avenue in the second wave for a demonstration of 1969, I believe it was. I belonged to a feminist consciousness raising group. And I remained political. In fact, when I was studying at Cal, as I said, I was studying radical psychiatry, which is a way of dismantling the traditional psychiatric institutions and being more liberatory. I also testified when I was a social worker and psychiatric social worker against shock treatments because my uncle had had shock treatments. And I saw what a vegetable he had become. And that was that was actually after my MSW and after moving to New York. But the time that really influenced how I became an anarchist was when I was at Cal. I took a course with a man who had been in the Kennedy administration as the secretary of what was not then Health and Human Services. But he told us all kinds of stories about being in the Kennedy White House. But he also told us to read books and he provided a list of titles. And one of them was Living My Life with Emma Goldman. And as soon as I read that book, I was already a feminist. And I realized that is where I belong. This is the ideology I can live with. The lack of hierarchy, the dismantlement of institutionalization in a powerful hierarchical way. And I applied it, of course, to gender. So I read everything I could when I was getting my MSW. My master's in public health, about anarchism and wrote about it. And then when I had to get my PhD in order to keep my job, I decided I wanted to do, well, in fact, what my first idea was I was going to study decentralization in the mental health system. But there was none. And I realized it was hard to talk about collectivizing mental health. But there was an advisor at Cornell who was studying Molly Steimer and Senya Fleshine, who were two anarchists who were deported because of their political activity in probably around 1919, 1920s. And so, and he found a woman by the name of Rose Pasoda, who as he was doing his archival work, And he said, "You ought to study this woman. She's quite remarkable." There had never been a full biography done on her. And so I wrote the biography of Rose Passoda, the third woman vice president of the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and and an anarchist. And she knew Sacco and Vanzetti, and I got to meet her family, talk to her radical friends, and I just felt like this is where I belonged. And so my whole life has been espousing anarchism, always being the left of the left, which is a term that was used about Sam Dolgoff, an anarchist in New York, and always arguing with the Marxists who believed in hierarchy and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and never about dismantling that hierarchy, as we've seen historically. And so I've always been a political activist. I mean, I've been in the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the Me Too movement, the Black Power movement. When I was in graduate school in New York, I took over the Grand Ballroom with the welfare rights movement at a big fancy hotel for the the National Welfare League demonstration, and kept my dean captive at the gate, at the doors, as we were demanding $5,500 or fight for welfare recipients, $5,500. This was 1969. Demonstrations in New York. I mean, in Washington, I've been gassed, I've been clubbed. I've negotiated with police on behalf of those who've been arrested because I'm obviously verbal and know how to deal with institutions, having worked in them my entire life, calling myself a guerrilla in the bureaucracy the whole time, even as a dean. I decentralize. Whenever I'm working in an institution, I empower those who've been disempowered and make sure that they are involved in decision making and implementation. And so my life has been imbued with anarchism since since my child, but actually since 1973 or 4, when I read Emma Goldman. And my latest work, which I've been doing for about 25 years now, is prison rights work. I started teaching in prison in 1997-ish, and realized about the racism, the inequality, the criminal injustice system. And I was smitten with having to somehow undermine the prison system, dismantle that. So my job has been 1, teaching, 2, running self-help groups, and most recently I've been doing victim offender dialogues in which I go into prisons. I meet with the people who've committed serious crimes. I only work in, now not always maximum security, but started only in maximum security prisons, only with men. And then I bring them together with the people that they harmed, either the people who are the family of those that they murdered or the victims of their own crimes. And I do reconciliation, restorative justice, which is really my political dedication right now. As a result of that, I now have a podcast on social justice and restorative justice. I've completed about 4 podcasts so far, but I'll probably be doing 2 or 3 more. I've been on the lecture circuit talking about spirituality and criminal justice reform, particularly restorative justice. So my politics will go to my grave, but I continue to write. as well around anarchism. I just had an article published on radical Jewish anarchist women. I just wrote a piece on, there was a movement in Eastern Europe called the Bund, which was not quite anarchist, it was more socialist, but they had some ideas about how to deal with imperialists and fascists. So I wrote an article recently about taking their ideas and applying it to Trump, because they really were talking about being here and being now, and dealing on a local and a state and a federal level here, not going elsewhere, to bring about dramatic social transformation. So I would say my life, my threads in my life are politics, radical anarchist politics, but and being progressive politically, and being an academic, a mother, and lots of other identities. You know, threads weave when you're this old. But let me say it. I've always been dedicated to social justice. I consider myself a memorial candle to my father's family who were killed in Lithuania, shot by the Nazis and Lithuanians at a pit outside of their village in Kupiskis, Lithuania. As a result, by the way, I now have citizenship in Lithuania and considering moving if to the EU, not to Lithuania, if the politics here continue. My family, my father got out, and that's how I survived, and I might have to get out as well. So that's a long story for a short question, and you're welcome to follow up if you like with any of this. Well, I would actually call myself an anarchist academic at this point, using a phrase that Paul Avrich, who was an anarchist historian, used. But I'm an anarchist communist, but I forgot to say, years and years and years ago, I was we called anarchist feminist. And I wrote with Peggy Korniger and Carol Ehrlich about, in fact, we had a book that was never published called Emma's Daughters. And so my ideology, my orientation is communism, anarchist communism, decentralized, a la Bakunin, Kropotkin, Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman. I used to go, I read PB and K, Proudhon, Bakunin, Kropotkin. That is where I'm rooted. And then in terms of the actions, I mean, I have to say I have been in violent demonstrations. I myself am not able to harm another human being. So, I don't really believe in assassination or murder of our enemies. This restorative justice has really taught me that everybody is redeemable if you reach their humanity. But my ideology is definitely feminist and anarchist and communist. And I'll be honest, I don't think we're going to have a revolution. When I was growing in the 60s, I thought the revolution was imminent. And I went to the barricades and got clubbed and gassed, and particularly in Washington and New York. But the revolution is not around the corner. And so now it's my ideology, but I'm a pragmatic anarchist. I work in institutions. In fact, it was very funny. I was an editor of the Journal of Social Anarchism, and with Howard Ehrlich. And when I became a dean, he told me I could no longer be on the board of social anarchism because my politics had become too mainstream. Well, they might be mainstream on a visual level. I'm a dean. But the reality is everything I do is imbued with egalitarianism. I'm on a board right now, and somebody tried to say that I was the chair of this organization. And I said, no, I'm not. This is a collectivist group. I happen to be the verbal one, but it's done collectively. So my ideology is very much still based in anarchism and feminism and anarcho-communism. Our job is to stretch the boundaries. We need to, as anarchists, introduce, and this is what I keep doing when I teach particularly, is introduce the ideas. We don't have to have hierarchy. We don't have to have people in power telling us what to do. We can decentralize. We can organize collectivistly. I was in an anarchist collective when we were protesting nuclear power plants. I went to, I can't even remember, it was in New Hampshire, and it was a collective where we made demonstrations against, it was after 3 Mile Island, but nonetheless. I went back and talked to my students about anarchist ideology. When I write, I just wrote this piece on Doikite. I make it available to a broader audience. I don't even always call it anarchism. I do when I'm teaching in university because, I'll introduce all kinds of political ideologies, and anarchism will be one of it. I don't push my ideology. I just say, hey, look at this. There are other ways of organizing a society. I bring up things historically. I talk about Spain during the Civil War and how, for a short period of time, there was an anarchist organization of the collectivists in Spain. And the bakers and the railroad workers and the women all decentralized and ran the country until Franco took over. I talk historically about different movements and collectives here. What was the line we used to use in the 60s? We're building a new society in the vacant lots of the old. And so I think anarchists' job is to make anarchism more understandable. I mean, I hate it when they say the term utter anarchy as if it's total chaos. It's not chaos. It's decentralized organization where everybody has a role. And let me tell you, I have worked in a number of collectives. It's really hard to work collectively. It's so much easier to have someone tell people what to do and to have a hierarchy. You have to talk it through. You have to compromise. You have to give to one side and give to the other side. It's a long and arduous process, as I have learned by being in many collectives. But it's worthy of the undertaking because in that way, everyone is empowered. And they buy in because they care. When I ran this school of psychology, people were telling me how empowered they felt by my inviting and engaging and having them contribute and help the decision making. And hopefully it will continue. So we have to plant the seeds. And that's, I guess, what I feel like I've done. I have had thousands of students now. I used to teach classes of 200. I recently had a class of 850. I've been teaching since 1977. So thousands and thousands of students, and they've all heard this from me. And I have a number of students now who are doing the kinds of work that I am so proud of. Young women who are doing work with those who've been trafficked, people who are working with youth who are incarcerated and trying to undermine the incarceration system, but working with these kids, the work that I do and others do in the critical work about prisons. And feminism, it's just part of the fabric of who I am. And I have to say, I'm a gutsy broad, as you might be able to see. I'm very outspoken, and wherever I go, people listen to me because I got a 2 masters and a PhD to prove to my family that I was not stupid and only charted to become a mother, a wife, and a housewife, which I did, but I wanted more. My work in restorative justice until recently has always been in prisons. And so it really is about forgiveness. It's about looking at who was harmed and who did the harm. And it's a sense of wanting to change the nature of the relationship, making it more equal. It's like anarchism, in which the person who did the harm speaks about how and why they did the harm, and the person who was harmed talks about the impact of the harm upon them. And then there's a dialogue of equal partners talking about resolution. There's confession, there's forgiveness, there's repentance, there's deep understanding of how one has been impacted by what occurred between them. I also recently did a restorative justice event at a place where I was working and found it not very effective because the people had not done the work prior to coming together, looking at who they were, why they did it, what were the triggers, what was the impact, and for the person who was harmed to begin to try to walk in the shoes of the other and understand why they did what they did. And then coming to mutual resolution. There's wonderful books on the little principles of restorative justice, which I always suggest people read. I write about restorative justice. I have a number of articles out about how I've been healed in the process because I was pretty pissed and angry for most of up until my 40s, probably, at many, particularly patriarchy and inequality. And so I've been healed by restorative justice, and I've watched other people be transformed in the process. It's deep, it's profound, it's transgressive in many ways because we are a competitive, kind of argumentative, violent society, and this is just the opposite of all of that. I hadn't thought of it until now, but it really is anarchism at its best because of the principles that I talked about earlier. My final remarks are I've come to almost the end of my life, and I want more people to work in the areas of social justice and social transformation. It used to be that I would want them to become anarchists. I don't care what they call themselves. I want them to be progressive people who really do understand the need for equality, equity, inclusion, any of the words that are now, held in in anger, by the administration. And I want people to work for dramatic social transformation. Doesn't have to be violent, but it has to happen because this world is an unjust and ugly place. There's moments of goodness, but there has to be transformation. So I'm handing it off to you, Philip Zura, and others of your generation to do the work that I've been doing and where I saw myself as a transition generation from the anarchists that I knew. I knew a lot of wonderful active anarchists who were in the labor movement and every other movement that was prevalent from the 1890s when the people I interviewed were born around then, all the way through the 1950s and 60s through today. So here's the cudgel or the sword or the piece flag being handed off to all of you.